Assassins, to another episode of the Dark Assassins podcast, the show that dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. Do you ever have a conversation with someone in somewhere along the lines, they just kind of start going off on a tangent somewhere, and you just kind of thinking to yourself, shoot, I don't remember asking, but thanks. Or maybe it's been in the reverse where you and someone else are having a conversation and you kind of just go off on a tangent and then they politely inform you that they forgot they asked. Well, that's basically all of what this episode is going to be, because you guys definitely did not ask. But I am going to be here answering questions that nobody asked and giving answers probably deeper than they deserve any right to give, but it's all in good fun. So that's what's coming up in this week's episode. And to kick off the fun, what better way to start with a trivia question about one of the most legendary executives in the history of humanity, that being Air Force One, aka Craig Federighi. So this week's trivia question is: Air Force One, aka Craig Federighi, is the Senior Vice President of Software Engineering at Apple, and he has a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering and a master's degree in computer science from what university? So what university did Craig Federighi get his degrees from? And that is your trivia question for the week. Moving right along, let's get into this week's cybersecurity tip. This week's cybersecurity tip is know if and when to deploy the nuclear option. Now, what is the nuclear option? I hear some of you asking, rightfully so. The nuclear option, at least in my definition, is the dead man's switch. Now, if you don't know what the dead man's switch is, don't worry, we're going to get into it in this episode. But technically speaking, the dead man's switch doesn't even have to be the nuclear option, although I think it's typically kind of associated with the nuclear option, but again, it doesn't have to be. So the idea is, when someone dies, somehow an action gets triggered that performs something. So in the sense of this not being the nuclear option, it could be when someone dies, it sends out a simple notification or message to someone, like an email or SMS message or something like that. Or it could be something like when someone dies, it sends a copy of their will to all parties involved in the will. Something very basic like that. But of course, you can do a lot more with it, like wipe all of your servers, all of your devices, basically everything. That's another use of the dead man switch. But how do you trigger the dead man switch? Because after all, you can't trigger something if you're dead, right? Like if I died tomorrow, I can't exactly log into my servers from beyond the grave and delete them and wipe them, or send information to someone for whatever reason. Can't exactly do that. So how does this work? Well, the most simple way to set up a dead man switch is to have some sort of control server somewhere, some kind of script or service or whatever you desire it to be, to basically have a countdown timer, however long you want it to be set for, that at a certain point it will go off and basically trigger whatever you want it to trigger. So essentially you set some kind of grace period. So let's assume that you have a a server set up where whenever you say ping it with a certain kind of packet, maybe you have a client somewhere that you can ping it with some kind of packet. You set up your own custom protocol, let's say. On the server end, that control server will have essentially a ongoing countdown timer, and it'll have some sort of grace period, whether that's 3 days, 2 weeks, a month, a single week. I mean, you could set it to be whatever you want it to, depending on how fine tuned you want it to be. But essentially, you kind of set that grace period of time, and then whenever you ping it with one of your packets to basically say, hey, I'm still here, then that grace time essentially resets itself back to whatever it is. So if, for instance, you have it set to trigger after, say, 2 days, and then after, say, maybe 24 hours had passed and you ping it, then it resets itself back to 48 hours and starts counting down again. So that's basically kind of in a nutshell the easy way to kind of set up your own dead man switch. And then basically everything after that is entirely up to you as far as what you want it to do. Now, if this is some kind of like command and control server you have set up that you want it to like essentially nuke everything, it's fairly easy to see how you would do that. You could have some kind of script, like maybe an Ansible script or some other kind of script, like a Python script or whatever, Bash script, to essentially log into every single one of your servers that you have and basically run a sudo rf, an rm-rf star, from the root directory, and basically nuke everything and basically make the systems unusable and then shut them down, and then they're basically never going to come back up again. Just something crazy like that. Or you could do the hacker route and basically just deploy ransomware across all of your machines. Maybe you have like a Python script to basically auto encrypt everything, from the root partition, from the root directory of your servers, and then you basically just essentially throw away the key. So there's tons of fun stuff you could do. Again, like we said, you could have it like send out like a text message or an email message or something of something you want to notify to someone or whatever. So this potentially could be useful in the sort of the nuclear option if you potentially had something you may not want people to know about, and you may or may not find yourself in the hands of people that might want as much data on you as possible. Maybe that could be a situation where a dead man switch triggers and, oh no, everything just kind of erased itself. Again, totally, fully hypothetical. I am not a lawyer at all, so this is not legal advice. But you might potentially run into some issues there of destroying evidence potentially. But then again, if everything was fine and then obviously you're under constant surveillance and then just suddenly everything just wipes itself, I'm not sure if you could necessarily be held accountable for that. Again, not a lawyer here, so this ain't legal advice or anything, but definitely interesting things to speculate about. Now, I get while we're kind of talking about a doomsday scenario here where you just kind of want to essentially wipe everything, wipe all the evidence, as it were. But what about some more practical applications of the dead man switch for someone like you and me, maybe someone that's not really getting into nefarious things that might get them under the watchful eye in a I guess captivity sense, if you will. One of the best examples that I can think of is having to do with your home lab. Now, if you're like me, you have a home lab and you're probably the only person in your household or in your family that knows how to operate it and knows what's in it. So there's a chance that, say, if something were to happen to you, um, your family would have absolutely no idea what any of these computers are doing, how they're configured, what is even in this home lab. Is there Like I think of course, I think the most obvious thing that people would be concerned about is things like family photos and family videos, because those are things that you just cannot get back. So if you run a home lab, there's a good chance that you have a some kind of storage solution set up, probably like a network attached storage or a NAS set up. And if you're the only one that knows how to access it, people are going to be very upset when if you happen to meet an untimely demise and they longer have access to those photos and videos. So a good dead man switch in that case would essentially be a way to like email or text out or something, notify loved ones essentially of how to essentially access your home lab. Now, how you do that is like entirely up to you, whether you basically want to say, like, just send a quick message like, here is the if you go to, this link on, your laptop, doesn't matter if you're connected on the my internal home lab network or not, you go here, and maybe you have like a Bitwarden setup or something with like all of your stuff, or you have something somewhere that has all of your knowledge dump just sitting there, that someone that has little to no technological experience could essentially understand enough to figure out what's going on in your home lab, how things are configured, how do they access the NAS, how is the network laid out, what kind of services are you running, things like that, to basically understand what they're dealing with and how to access things if they need it. And then they can, go and do whatever they need or want with it. So that's just kind of, I think, probably the most practical example for most people. Now, again, you do have to be careful with the dead man switch, because depending on what your grace period is set to, if you make it too tight, like, and essentially like the grace period is too small, you run the chance of having it potentially trigger when you don't want it to. But if you have it too long, there's a chance that it could be well after you're kind of gone, and at that point it's kind of useless, because maybe they've already gotten rid of the hardware that was, that had the dead man switch on it in the first place. So you do I mean, it's going to be I guess some fine tuning on your part of like how you want to set it up, but that is something that I figured I would kind of bring up in this cybersecurity tip for the week. So yeah, know if and or when to deploy the dead man switch, and that is your cybersecurity tip for the week. So again, moving right along, let's get into what nerdy stuff have I been up to this week. So last week, I mentioned that as soon as I kind of revamped my test cases and pushed everything, essentially reworking how everything worked to use multiple arrays to house the name of the test cases as well as the functions that the test cases point to. As soon as I finished creating that, I realized there was probably a better solution. So to kind of recap briefly what the scenario was, I had two separate arrays, like I mentioned. One had the name of the test case, and the other was an array of function pointers. So essentially, the array of the names of the test cases would print, and then with their associated test case number, and then you would enter the number you want, and that would index into the array of function pointers and run the test case. And this worked great. It made it very dynamic, so I could change and reorder test cases at will and not have to worry about modifying any of the underlying code that prints out the menu or handles how, which test case is selected, which is not how it was before. So overall, massive improvement. But the issue I kind of realized after I came up with this solution is, what happens if I change one array but not the other one? Then we're going to have some problems. Now, there's a couple problems that I can think of right off the bat, and you might have already thought of these as well. What if you added a test case, say the name of a test case, to one array but not the other one, not the function pointer to the other one, or vice versa? You added the function pointer to the function pointer array, but you didn't add an instance in the name of the test case array. What are you going to do then? The other notable issue is, what if you decided to reorder the test cases? So say you moved around the order of some of the function pointers in that array, but you didn't touch the names of the test cases, that is a very real thing that would probably happen. So those are some of the kind of the big glaring issues with that solution. So I decided that a better solution would either to be use some kind of map or some kind of array of pairs. So the solution I ended up going with was an array of pairs. And I like this solution, one, because it's very simple. It's an array. It's it's a fixed size thing. And I can reorder things as much as I want, and I already have a variable to auto-calculate the size for me. Yes, I know I could do it with a map and I wouldn't have to worry about auto-calculating the size. I understand. But the nice thing about the pair too is it kind of works in a similar vein as the map, where you kind of have two things tied to one another. So in this instance, I have a string and a function pointer kind of paired together. So of course you have the string, which is the name of the test case, like kind of like the human readable name of the test case. So like, testing of like PP changes or testing of the encounter table, things like that. And then you have like the actual function pointer like to the actual test, so like encounter table test or whatever the test case is. So this way, if you want to move things around, you basically you can, in this way, well, actually, I guess let me take a step back. The nice thing about this is because both the name of the test case and the function pointer are on the same line, you can literally just cut and paste the line wherever you want and everything will line up perfectly. Plus, you only have to deal with one array now. So this did mean I had to modify the function that prints out the name of the test cases, as well as the function that runs the test cases. But if we're being honest, the biggest change was just changing the one of the parameters in the function to be an std pair array. That was basically it. And then of course indexing in on if it's the first or the second element, depending on what we're trying to deal with. But very simple, very easy to change. So that was a very, very happy that I got that change. I like how it's working now. So very happy to see that. And the other thing I changed was something I noticed shortly after I implemented the encounter table test case. So the issue with trying to write a test case to test something that is inherently random is verifying that your random number generation is actually what you expect, because at the end of the day, it's random. So you could get what you expect, or you could have the off chance where you get something that you don't expect at all. Now, one way to kind of get around this is to make your sample size extremely large. That way you have a very large sample size, so when it all kind of boils down and you find the average, it basically comes out to what you expect. The problem is, depending on how big your sample size is, it can exponentially increase the runtime of the test case. So you have to kind of find the balance between what's a large enough sample size to get me what I expect the vast majority of the time, but also isn't going to take a very long time to actually run. So I think the number I settled on was like 10,000 or something like that, and essentially 10,000 generated encounters, and basically take the averages, basically how many instances of each encounter it was, and then divide it by 10,000 and kind of get the number, and basically check to see if that is what the weight was, kind of within a margin of error, and if it's in that range, then we're good to go. Otherwise, the test case fails. So everything was working great. And then I noticed one time when I was looking at my pipeline that I had a failure in one of the tests. And I was like, oh no, what happened? And went to check the test case, and sure enough, the RNG encounter table test failed. So I was like, okay, and it only happened once, so I knew this was a very much like a one-off type thing. It's not something that's going to happen on a regular basis. So essentially what I did was basically implemented a retry mechanism. So how that works is it basically has a counter. I think I currently have it set to retry it retry it once, so basically 2 tries at it. So in that way, if you do have one of these unexpected failures occur, it'll basically just try to run it again. And I would say the like 99.9999% of the time, it's going to work on the second time if it doesn't work on the first time because of how large the sample size is. Now, could it fail both times? Absolutely, because again, we're dealing with random numbers here. But at least it's a little more fault tolerant, I guess we'll say. So anyone that if this gets to the point where more people besides me end up, writing code for this and running the test cases, they won't be trying to beat their head against the wall, trying to wonder why this one test case every now and again just happens to fail. Now, granted, if you actually read through the code, you could see, oh, this is a random test case, so I could see why this potentially could just randomly fail, because the RNG gods or whatever decide to pull a funny one on you, try to pull a fast one and, pull one over on you, and, the test case fails. But again, that was one of the reasons, one of the motivators, I guess, why I put that in there. Now, I was thinking about just modifying the pipeline to do the retry in the pipeline, like if the whole test suite fails, to essentially retry it again. But I figure that'd be kind of a waste for a couple reasons. One, most of the time, because at this point there's only that one test that could potentially fail randomly, even though it didn't actually fail. All the other tests are basically solid, and if they fail for some reason, something is seriously wrong. Plus, on the other hand, like if you're trying to test locally, it's also nice to have that retry in there, just because if you're a developer working on test cases and you see one test case randomly fails every now and again, but when you push it through the pipeline, it always passes no matter what, you're probably going to be scratching your heads and thinking what's going on with my machine to cause this thing to fail? So I just figured to basically make everything the same, build in the retry directly into the test case itself. That way, you're basically always going to get the same results, whether you're running the tests locally, running them on a dev server somewhere, or running it in a pipeline. So that was kind of some of the thoughts behind why I went about doing that. And I'm very happy with the result. Technically, there have been 0 failures so far, so I guess that is a good thing, when there was technically 1 failure before I added the retry mechanism in. So even though the sample size is very small in this case, I think it's still going to be a net benefit in the long run. So with that, let's get into some questions that literally nobody asked. And the first question we have is, if the world could only use one operating system, what would it be? Now, the normie answer to this question, I think, is pretty simple. And the normie answer would be by far Windows. But that is the wrong answer. But let me give you the rationale behind why the normie answer would be Windows. And quite simply, Windows is by far the market leader when it comes to desktop operating systems. So in that sense, it makes sense that everyone in the world would just have to use Windows, because if we're being honest, most people use Windows already anyway. So it's not like you're having to force a ton of people to switch operating systems. But that is a very, very, very narrow view of things. And the reason why it's wrong that Windows wouldn't or shouldn't be the only operating system that gets used is because you have to think of the internet as a whole and the world as a whole. Because basically, well, I guess it depends on what the numbers and metrics you're looking at, but like Windows is the desktop dominator in terms of market share, Linux is the dominator in the server world. So if you made basically every server in the world switch to Windows, a lot of internet services would just simply not be functional anymore. So rather than basically taking down the entire internet, I think it would be a lot easier to make people that have never used Linux before use Linux. At least that's in my opinion, but again, I'm kind of biased because I also like Linux and I prefer it over Windows. But then again, um, you could also make the argument that, well, I would make the argument that obviously this is not a biased opinion because I am a daily Mac user. My personal operating system of choice is Mac OS, which I know is also very hypocritical because I also pride myself on being very pro open source, yet here I am using a proprietary operating system, but nobody's perfect, I guess. But one of the reasons why I never switched to Linux was because I found Mac OS first. um, because honestly, if I didn't find Mac OS first and I didn't use iPhones, I probably would be using Linux as my daily driver, if I'm being completely honest. Now, I also do have a Linux laptop that I use like for on the go dev work, which I do use, well, I guess not super frequently anymore, but I used to use fairly frequently, but it was never like full on like daily driver type laptop material. But I mean, if we're thinking about it at the end of the day, it's not necessarily as big of an ask to make every desktop user switch operating systems because at the end of the day, I think the vast majority of your computer user is just using the computer to access the internet to browse the web. And that's what made Chromebooks so successful, right? Wait, what's that? Uh huh. Mm hmm. Oh, Chromebooks didn't dominate the market? And their market share is less than the Linux desktop? Well, Uh, whew, yeah, so, anyway, but the point is, if everyone had to switch to Linux as their daily driver operating system, all they would basically do is maybe download an extra browser, maybe not, and also, because of how customizable Linux is, you could make a Linux skin that looks basically just like Windows if you really, really wanted to. One time back in the day, I tried to make a Linux skin to look basically just like Mac OS, and that worked pretty well. Basically most of the surface level stuff was pretty good. Like all the icons were very Mac OS like, kind of got the taskbar at the top looking like Mac OS. But then when you really got under the hood of things, the illusion kind of fell apart. But you know, it had the looks, I guess. But yeah, so but I mean, for also for me, again, maybe part where I'm biased is my entire home lab runs Linux. Now I guess there are a few exceptions. I do have a couple of Windows environments specifically for development testing, and then I have some Mac OS environments again specifically for development testing. But everything that's running a service like my media server, VPN, Bitwarden, all that stuff, every other service I'm running in my home lab is using some flavor of Linux, which kind of just adds more credence to the fact that the majority of the internet servers do run Linux. So, in my opinion, if the entire world could only use one operating system, it would be Linux. Moving on to the next question. Interfacing with databases is tedious. Writing text files is easy, so why not store all of your data into a text file or some other kind of file? You know, this honestly isn't a bad idea. Now, before you start flaming me for saying that, it obviously depends on scale. Now, if you're talking about a massive enterprise solution, yes, writing everything to a single file is a very, very, very bad idea. But if you're only dealing with a small desktop application that isn't going to have a large amount of data associated with it, honestly, writing it to a single file isn't necessarily that bad of an idea. Now, is it the best practice? No, but is it necessarily a bad idea, especially if you're trying to get something out the door really quickly? I would argue no. Now, again, this is kind of talking from personal experience. Back in the day, I tried to write my own operating system in Java, which, yes, me saying I'm writing an operating system in Java is like saying I'm writing a native mobile application in JavaScript. It just doesn't work like that. But the way the quote unquote operating system worked was it was essentially a thing that ran on top of an actual operating system, but allowed you, to have features like logging into your own session with customized settings. You had your own email, but again, the email could only send emails internally to other users within this one application. You could access the internet, but again, that would just kind of bring up your default web browser to whatever your current system was running. And then there were some other odds and ends applications that I kind of threw in there from previous Java programs that I wrote. But all of this data was stored into a single serialized file. Was it the best practice? Absolutely not. But this was newbie Dark Assassin first, getting into programming in his first few years of writing code. And up until that point, that was by far the biggest project I had ever undertaken. Only I think recently, well, I guess not recently, since it's probably a few years ago when it got surpassed. But the current video game, the Pokemon game I'm working on, is now currently the leader for the largest project I've worked on. But that's neither here nor there. The point is, when I was first creating that project, everything was written to a single file. All the emails throughout the entire system. So, for instance, if you, for whatever reason, had like, say, 20 accounts and each account had like 200 emails in it, all of those emails would be stored in this single file. Also, so all the accounts, all of the user settings, there was like a mini kind of like, I tried to create like a version of like essentially notepad in there that you could like create files and load in files. All those files would be written into this one single file. So it would get very big very quickly and would definitely not be manageable. But for a small scale kind of project like that, it technically still worked. But again, like I mentioned at the very beginning here, the issue is scalability and performance. Because if you're especially if you're trying to make like a very high performant application with multiple threads, if every single thread is going to be bottlenecked writing to a single file that has absolutely zero thread safety, and your only means of ensuring that you don't run into kind of race conditions is through like mutex locks and things like that, your program is going to hit all kinds of bottlenecks, slowdowns, and problems. And it's just not going to be a very fun time. The other thing, like I mentioned, is if once you kind of get bigger and you have more data associated with this program, having it all stored in one file is really not the best solution, because trying to read all that data from the file, I mean, one, you have to make sure you have enough memory in order to ingest it, or I guess you could chunk it off into blocks and only read parts of the file in, but then every time you needed to access a different portion, you'd basically have to go back to disk, read in different chunks, and it would just be a nightmare to deal with. So yeah, really not a good long-term solution. But again, it really depends on what your scale is. But regardless of scalability, best practice wise, it is still a very bad idea. The next question that nobody asked, although I think this is probably a question that people have in the back of their minds, maybe, but no one, I don't think, has really asked, which is, what if the internet shut down tomorrow? Well, let's just say the developed world would lose their absolute what, because basically everything would just stop working. Now, the main problem here is how many devices these days are basically tethered to the internet. And without a constant internet connection, are basically glorified paperweights. It's very sad that that's the way things are, but that's kind of the world we live in because data is everything. So the more data that you can, I guess, siphon off, the better. But yeah, so many devices their need for a constant internet connection, and if they don't have one, they basically turn into bricks. Would harm a lot of things. Now, the good news is, if you're a home labber and all of your stuff is self-hosted, uh, basically nothing would be out of the ordinary to you. Now, sure, you couldn't, go on, your internet browser of choice with your internet search engine of choice to look things up. But for instance, if you had your own self-hosted large language model, you could still ask it questions to your heart's desire. If you had your own media library through something like Plex or, well, maybe not Plex, but Jellyfin, you could still watch all of your own media as much as you'd like. So if you have your own, code repo, in your home lab, you could still write and develop code. You wouldn't notice a whole lot different. But anyone that doesn't have a home lab would be in a very, very different situation. And especially all those with like the cloud connected like security type systems, like the smart cameras and the smart locks, that would be a big oof. The main question I would have is, personally, I don't own any of this stuff because I don't trust any of it. But I don't know if I've mentioned it on the podcast before, but I would be open to the idea of having like security cameras like around my house, but I would have to ensure that they don't connect out to like the public internet at all. Everything is contained locally. They're on their own VLAN, and basically only I have access to them from the internals of my home network. That's the only way I would be okay with something like that. Smart locks, really not a fan of. I get the convenience of them, but as a software developer, I kind of know how buggy software can be, and I personally just don't trust it. Now, I know physical locks can also be picked fairly easily from a professional locksmith. So I guess you just kind of have to pick which one you want, the lesser of two evils. But going back to the smart locks thing, depending on how the smart lock works, if it always has to have, this connection to the internet and the cloud in order to operate, there, I guess, potentially is a chance that you could get locked out of your own house, which would be very, very unfortunate. Now, I would like to think that there would be some sort of manual override that you could perform, but I guess that might be something that would vary from like smart lock to smart lock. But the other thing too is, if the internet just kind of totally went offline, the only way that you would really be able to buy anything is as if you had cash on hand, which, if we're being honest, I don't think most people carry cash on hand. Now, there are some people that absolutely do, and they would, be laughing at everyone else. But most people just, must pay with a credit card or a debit card, in which case you're not going to be paying with that if the internet is down. So the other thing too is, you're probably not going to be going anywhere either. Because again, unless you have cash to pay for gas, which, yeah, if you don't have cash to pay for gas, you're probably not going to be able to buy gas, and you're not exactly going to be able to, ride a train or an airplane or anything like that, because they kind of rely on the internet in order to coordinate things. So that's probably not going to happen. So yeah, you're probably not really going to be going anywhere. But the other big rip, if the internet just completely went offline, is the loss of knowledge that would happen, because so much of humanity's collective knowledge is on the internet, whether that's, scanned in books from libraries, or whether that's, things that only ever existed and were created on the internet. All that would be just gone, which would probably be a very, very bad thing and very detrimental overall. But also, because everything on the internet would be gone, think of all of the memes that would be lost. Memes basically only ever existed when the internet existed, and basically only exist on the internet. So if the internet just went bye bye tomorrow, all those memes are going to go along with it. Now, if you're someone like me and has potentially an undisclosed number of gigabytes worth of memes that they have stored, you at least get to keep those, your own private collections, I guess, would be unaffected. But again, if those are stored in a cloud hosted storage somewhere, then you're kind of out of luck. But if you have them stored in your home lab somewhere, then you don't really have to worry about it. So yeah, the next question that nobody asked is, what if virtual reality became indistinguishable from reality? So the short answer to this question is read the book Ready Player 2. The long answer to this question is I think most people would probably spend as much time in the virtual space as they could, partly because they could be anything, be anywhere, go anywhere, do anything, be anyone, basically do whatever they please. Since if you think about it, how awesome would it be to physically be present in your favorite movie, TV show, video game, or whatever, and kind of like interact with everything going on there, right? Like, I think a lot of people have probably fantasized about whatever like their favorite movie or TV series is. Like, what if they were right there in the action, in the thick of it with the actors, and were a part of it? Well, in this potential future world where virtual reality was English indistinguishable from reality, it's very feasible to think that that would be something that you could absolutely do and would be a very common occurrence. Video games, especially, I think, would be a very big seller in that market. I think video games would do very well in that kind of space. Um, but I guess because again, no one asked this question, I can make up the rules as I go. I think one thing we do have to clarify and make a clarifying distinction is, what do we mean by indistinguishable? Because if we mean strictly visually, like you put on the VR headset or the VR glasses or whatever you're putting on, and what you see in this virtual space looks identical to what you would see in the real world, like you couldn't make that distinction. Honestly, I think that's probably realistically going to come within like the next 5 to 10 years, because I mean, if you look at some of the current VR headsets on the market now, they already do a very, very, very good job of replicating things. Now, sure, their pass through is still obviously not as good as if you didn't have the headset on, but some of the environments that they can create do look, at least from what I've read anyway, look very, very, very realistic. Like the Vision Pro, for instance. One thing that it's gotten rave reviews about is how realistic things look, kind of in that virtual reality. So I think if we're strictly talking about just the visuals and maybe auditory too, that's, I think, coming very soon. But if we're talking about all of the senses and virtual reality having like all of the senses, being incorporated in that and being indistinguishable from the real world, that I think is something that's going to be a lot further out, because it's going to be a lot harder to recreate things like smell, taste, and touch compared to just like visuals and auditory. Because for that, you just put a headset on, you put like earbuds in, and you can get most of that, right? But to actually recreate, the more of the physical sensations, like the physical sensations of like touching, feeling, the ability to taste and smell things around you, that's going to take a heck of a lot more work. But I think one of the other difficult things about making it indistinguishable from reality is, how do you deal with the moving aspect? Because if you've ever played like a virtual reality game or something that requires you to move, like there's usually some kind of like controller thing or something that like you can move your character around, but that obviously is not how reality works. I have seen like some instances where people will kind of like there's like this I don't know how to describe it, but it's like this kind of like a bowl shaped thing that you can kind of like harness yourself into, and it's like kind of run on it essentially in like any direction. So maybe some kind of tech like that. I'm pretty sure Marquez Brownlee did a video, I don't remember when it was, maybe like a year ago or so, about some kind of like sort of omnidirectional treadmill in a sense, where it was basically a bunch of like little balls on kind of like a surface that you could would essentially allow you to walk endlessly anywhere. Now it did take some, at least from the video, it did looks like it did take some adjusting to actually get used to. But something like that potentially. But I think that's going to be one of the big things, because that would be a massive dead giveaway that it's not virtual reality is not the same as actual reality is the moving around feature, right? Because for instance, if you're playing like a virtual reality game in your living room, you can only walk so far in a given direction, and if your character has, miles and miles ahead of them that they can walk, and they can just keep going, but you can only walk like 5 feet in that one direction, well, the illusion is gone pretty quickly. Now, one thing that I haven't addressed yet, which I can already hear some people screaming, is the whole loneliness epidemic becoming even worse. Because one thing that millennials and Gen Zers love to whine and complain about is this whole idea of the loneliness epidemic, in large part because of social media. Thank you very much, Zuck. But one thing that I'm not going to do on this podcast is debate whether that is a problem or not, because there are probably podcasts out there that do that, and you could easily do one or multiple episodes arguing till you're blue in the face about whether that is a real thing or not. But suffice it to say, I do think if virtual reality became indistinguishable from reality, it would probably just expand on that even more, whether it makes it actually become a real thing or if it already is a real thing and makes it worse. Whatever your view on it is, I think it'll just kind of, basically exponentially grow essentially, because I think a lot of people would spend a lot of time in the virtual area. The next one is, what if artificial intelligence could read and write human emotions, basically understand human emotions? Well, again, the short answer is watch the movie Ex Machina. The long answer is humans would be absolutely cooked. Human emotions is by far the most glaring vulnerability that humans have. And I use that word deliberately because while it might be a sensitive topic, it is true nonetheless, because that in essence is all of what social engineering attacks do and why they work. Because social engineering attacks, as we've talked about on the podcast before, prey on people's emotions and basically exploit those emotions. So if AI could also read those emotions and exploit those emotions, yeah, we would kind of be toast. This is also why throughout history you kind of see one of the most ways that, I guess we'll just say not very nice governments throughout history tend to control their populaces is through fear and other emotional controlling ways to basically keep people in line. Because again, emotion is one of a human's greatest vulnerabilities. So if AI could take advantage of that, yeah, we would be in a very, very bad spot. The next question is, we're starting to get into, I guess this is the last one, but we're getting into a very off the walls, no one asked this type of question. And that is, what if you had to do a push-up for every line of code that you write? So this one is interesting because there's a couple ways to look at it. On the one hand, every developer would be jacked out of their loving minds. that would be the one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is developers would still be, I guess in the stereotypical sense, very scrawny and unathletic. And the reason for that is because not all, but stereotypically, developers aren't exactly the most active people, shall we say, and they are generally seen as very lazy individuals. And I know because I am one. But because of that, developers find very ingenious ways to make the mundane, boring things in their life easy. In other words, they automate things. So if there is a very repetitive task that they get very bored of doing, because they are lazy, they will write a tool to do that task for them so they no longer have to do it. I know this because I have done it on several occasions. So when it comes to them having to do a push-up for every line of code they write, they will see this as an obstacle to them, their well-being. They don't want to do it because doing a push-up is work and they don't want to do work. So some developers obviously will just kind of suck it up and do it and just do a push-up for every line of code they write, and they will be very jacked. But you also have the other developers that won't want to write more lines of code than they need because they don't want to do push-ups. So they will write some of the worst code that you have ever seen. I mean, we're talking like, and when I say like write a line of code, I don't mean like every new line of code you write. I mean, if there is already code that exists and you refactor it, or like, for instance, there's an if statement that already exists and you add an extra condition in there, that is a line of code that you wrote, so you're doing a push-up. If you refactored, say, 10 lines of code that already existed into, say, 9 lines of code, well, now you're doing 9 push-ups. So that's what I mean. It's not like new lines of code written, it's any lines of code written. Or I guess any lines of code modified is maybe another way of saying it. So in essence, what I could very, very easily see happening is developers would write some of the most disgusting, unreadable hodgepodge of spaghetti that you have ever seen. I mean, you think vibe coding makes some unreadable, horrible code. You haven't seen nothing yet. Do not tempt and do not test a developer when it comes to writing some of the most horribly visually ununderstandable code that you have ever seen. Because if the options are them having to do physical labor or them writing some of the worst code that you have ever seen and laid your eyes upon in order to get out of it, they're going to choose the latter. At least some of them will. So in essence, some of the very, very lazy developers will find ways to basically create the most convoluted one-liners imaginable. So you all know, if you've ever taken a programming class, there's probably been at least one guy or gal that tries to do everything on a single line, like in a return statement. And you can absolutely do this, but the readability and understandability of the code goes down significantly. Now imagine that like basically multiplied by 10 or more, and basically every single function. So rather than, making it very understandable and digestible, doing calculations step by step, storing them into variables, and things like this, what the solution would probably end up looking like is nested ternary operators, lambdas inside of lambdas, performing all the steps of a calculation into one rather than breaking it out into variables, and basically doing this all in a single line of code. That way, you technically only wrote a single line of code, so you only have to do one push-up. Now, granted, if you actually wrote it in a readable fashion, it might have been 15, 20 lines of code, but because you crammed it all into one, you only have to do one push-up, so that's a win. At least that's how some developers would look at it. And comments, they would go out the window. Comments would be no longer existent because a comment is a line in the source code file, which thereby means you have to do a push-up. So that means developers essentially would not write and add comments in their code unless they did, one of those, like they write the line of code and then at the very end of the line they kind of have a comment of what it does. Depending on how you format your code, that could be something you do. I've done it on some occasions depending on how long the line of code is, since I'm one of the kinds of guys that really likes strict column width restrictions. I used to not care, but now I just like the visual appeal of having set column width limits. So if it's like a very short line of code, and the comment that I want to write is pretty short, I'll usually put it like, next to the line of code, but otherwise I'll just put it on top. But the problem is in this situation is if you did put it on top, guess what? You just wrote 2 lines of code, so you have to do 2 push-ups. But if you put it on the same line, then you only have to do 1 push-up. But I guess one way to, force developers out of this would be to enforce things like column width limits. And one easy way you could do that is if you're using some kind of like code formatter, like Clang is, I guess, a very easy one, Clang format. But again, depending on your language, that may or may not work. But most languages, I think, have some kind of formatting type tool associated with them that you can kind of write some kind of configuration file that will kind of like auto format your code for you. In which case, it doesn't matter how disgusting of a one-liner you write, it will get made into multiple lines, in which case all of that work was for nothing. But I can probably assure you that if this did exist, there would be a lot of developers out there advocating for the removal of column width restrictions so they could get away with things like this. So yeah, I thought it would be fun to end on a very wild and out there kind of fun question for the episode. But before we get out of here, we do have to return to our trivia question for the week, which is Hair Force One, aka Craig Federighi, is the Senior Vice President of Software Engineering at Apple and has a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering and a master's degree in computer science from what university? So again, what university did Craig Federighi get his degrees from? If you said UC Berkeley, congratulations, you got this week's trivia question correct. And yeah, thought it would be fun to give a little Craig Federighi question because in case you didn't know, WWDC, or Apple's Worldwide Developer Conference, is about a week and a half away from from the day this podcast goes live. It'll be just over. Well, actually, wait, hold on. Let me look up my calendar here. Actually, I guess it's more like 2 weeks away. But regardless, it's coming up fairly soon. So I hope you guys are getting ready for it and are excited, because I know I am. One of the memes I actually have kind of heard about WWDC is because of the interesting results of the rollout of Apple Intelligence. Some people have thought that the Apple Intelligence portion of the keynote at WWDC this year is basically going to be the same thing as last year, because a lot of the features haven't even shipped yet. So it will be interesting to see what they do, because you already know they're going to talk about Apple Intelligence. So it's going to be very interesting to see what they talk about, because a lot of the stuff they talked about last year, all those like enhancements to like Siri and like its Siri's contextual awareness, haven't even shown up yet. And Apple even mentioned somewhere, I don't know if it was a press release or what, like maybe a couple weeks ago, sometime like a month ago, I don't remember. It wasn't all that long ago that they basically kind of pushed back that promise of it's coming later this year to like, yeah, it's coming eventually. So yeah, there's also been like a ton of drama, it sounds like, internally at Apple, between like I think Craig and like whoever the AI guy was, that guy from Google, Gene Andrea, I think, and like how he kind of got removed, and like the Vision Pro guy kind of got put in his spot. It sounds like there's a whole bunch of turmoil going on there. I don't know, I haven't been following it super closely, but I mean, based on the rollout of Apple Intelligence, it doesn't necessarily surprise me that there's a lot of turmoil going on, but I guess that's neither here nor there. It'll be interesting to see what goes on at WWDC. So I think probably the week before Dub Dub, we'll probably do some kind of like get you ready for it, kind of go over maybe what we can expect to see, maybe give some predictions. And then, of course, the week of WWDC, we'll kind of get into all the goodies that Apple is promising, maybe in the case of like Apple Intelligence last year. Whether it all comes out or not, I guess, is TBD. But I think it is safe to say that every feature that they demo at WWDC will not be available the day that iOS will be on at that point, 19, and macOS, I think 16. When those OSs drop, all the features that they demo obviously are not coming on day one. I think that is something safe that we can put money on. Because, I mean, you don't have to look, I mean, you can look back many years, and that's kind of basically how things go. Not all the features that get demoed at WWDC drop when the 0.0 release drops. They usually get, kind of sprinkled out, throughout the year. Or in the case of Apple Intelligence, some of them just I guess don't show up. But I guess we will see. So I'm interested and looking forward to that. But that's going to wrap it up for this week's episode. So if you enjoyed, definitely be sure to leave it a rating and review and subscribe if you haven't done so already. And if you have any questions, comments, topics, or ideas for future episodes, shoot me an email at contact@darkassassinsinc.com, or you can leave a comment down below if you're on YouTube. And that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. Until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, bool nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins podcast.